and welcome to another video for my Case Me a Christmas Card series. Today my guest is Kelly Taylor, who is on the Hero Arts design team, and so I'm actually going to be using some Hero Arts products today. So I'm starting with the Wishing You tree stamp set. I'm going to be using the matching dies as well. So what I'm starting with is some Versamark ink, and I'm going to be embossing this image, but I'm actually going to be embossing it multiple times because today not only am I going to be using multiple images on my card, I'm going to be making multiple cards in two different colour schemes. So I'm using my MISTI to make sure I get a really good impression here, because you don't want to muck up your embossing. I actually did muck up the embossing on one of these because I didn't ink up my stamp well enough, but I managed to fix it. It's okay. All right, so I'm covering this in some white embossing powder, making sure I've got good coverage, and I find that I didn't have good coverage, but it's all right. I went over it with a white gel pen after I did the colouring so I could see exactly where I needed to add the white. All right, so now I've got the matching die. And I'll be cutting this tree out from this piece. Now, you might think, why on earth has she stamped it right in the middle of this piece? Isn't that a bit wasteful? Well, I'm actually going to be using both the positive and the negative of this particular piece. The positive, that one I've just cut out, I will be using to add to my card, but the negative I'm going to be using so that I get the stamping done correctly on all the rest of the die cuts. So you can see I'm just going to be using the die here to cut out just white cardstock before I've stamped on it, but then I'm able to just take those die cuts, pop them straight into that negative piece that I've got in my MISTI. I haven't moved the stamp at all from the first one that I stamped. I'm making sure that I use my anti-static powder tool from the rabbit hole to make sure that any stray embossing powder doesn't actually stick to any fingerprints or anything. And now you can see that the stamp will stamp exactly, perfectly positioned onto those die cuts. So I don't have to worry about lining up the die or lining up the stamp every single time, because I've got that negative piece there, making sure it's all perfect. And it makes production line stamping a whole lot easier to do it this way. So now that I've got all of those stamped, I can go ahead and pour my embossing powder onto each one. And I'm trying to keep my fingers out of the way, and then I'm going to heat these up to melt that embossing powder. Again, trying to keep my fingers out of the way. I have to tell you, I did actually burn my fingers because I really should be holding this piece with a pair of tweezers, shouldn't I? But I didn't. Anyway, this is the card of Kelly's that I am going to be casing today. She used an image that she die cut 3 times and lined it up across the bottom of her card, and then she had a bold white embossed sentiment on a coloured piece of cardstock above them. So that's the plan for today. I'm going to have 3 trees with bright colours, and then I'm going to have a white embossed sentiment on, well, I'm actually using a black panel for my sentiment, not a coloured panel. But for these images, I did white embossing, whereas Kelly stamped in black for her images. And I'm just going to be using ink blending with these Distress Oxides to get the colour onto these trees pretty quickly. So yeah, once all the die cutting was done, these were relatively quick to put together, because the ink blending, I'm not really paying much attention to getting the ink blending perfect, and I'll tell you why in a little bit, as long as I've got some good coverage. Now, when I first made this card, I originally was going to have the trees a lot lower down on the card, so I didn't bother doing the ink blending on the bottom of these trees because I knew I was going to cut them off. But then when I put them onto the card, I decided I wanted them a bit higher, but I really liked the look of the ink blending just fading off into white at the bottom. So I left the bottom of the tree white. So that's why that is the way it is. It was just a happy accident that I liked it that way. All right, so I've got all of those distress oxides. So on these trees, I've used Twisted Citron, Peacock Feathers and Mermaid Lagoon as my 3 colours. But on the other trees, I'm going to go slightly different colour scheme. So making sure that I don't contaminate my project, I'm going to wipe down my workstation here to make sure I don't have any of that green and blue ink left. And now I'm moving on to the pinks and the purples. So the colours that I've got for the second one are the Kitsch Flamingo, which is this bright pink colour. Then I'm going to be using Picked Raspberry, which is a hot pink colour, much darker than the Kitsch Flamingo. And then I will also use Wilted Violet, which is a beautiful mid-purple colour, which I really like. I just decided that, green is kind of an expected colour for Christmas trees, but I always like to, I really do like Christmas cards that are red and green. I like traditional kinds of Christmas cards, but I also like to have Christmas cards with unexpected colour schemes on them. So that's why I went with the pink and purple because, not necessarily a traditional colour for Christmas time. Now, you can see on these trees that this Distress Oxide is covering up a lot of the embossing. The embossing is not shining through particularly well in some places on this. That is because I'm using Distress Oxide inks, and Distress Oxide inks have a pigment property to them, and that pigment sits on top of the embossing and sort of covers it up a little bit. So once I have finished with the inking, which I'll be finished with the inking very, very shortly, once I've got this purple on there, I'm actually going to be wiping over these trees with a dry cloth to make that embossing shine through a little bit more. Okay, so right now I'm just going to wipe off my workstation, get rid of the excess ink, and then I've got my dry cloth and you can see I'm rubbing off that embossing, and you can see the embossing shine through so much better after I've wiped over that those trees. So I'll do that with all 6 trees, and it's amazing the difference it makes once you actually remove any excess ink that's sitting on top of the embossing. All right, so now my trees are ready to go, except remember I didn't emboss one of them very well, so I'm just using my white gel pen to go over any embossing lines that didn't quite emboss perfectly the first time. But while I've still got my Misty out, I am going to be stamping my sentiments. So this sentiment is from the same stamp set as the trees, and I'm going to be stamping it twice onto some Hero Arts black cardstock, which is my favourite cardstock to use. I've stamped it twice because I've got 2 cards that I'm going to be doing. Again, I used Versamark ink, and I'm adding my Hero Arts white embossing powder there, making sure that I've got really good coverage over those words and making sure I don't have any excess little bits of embossing powder sitting anywhere. Now, I decided, unlike Kelly's card, Kelly cut around her sentiment as a sort of a rectangle, but I decided that doing that would cover up way too much of the trees on my card for my liking, and it would add way too much black on my card for my liking. So I decided to cut down the sentiment and just fussy cut around it so that it just has a very sort of narrow black edge. So I'm just using my tape runner adhesive here, so my Kikuyo tape runner, And I'm making sure the other 2 trees are lined up before I add the third one so that they're sort of relatively evenly spaced across the front of my card. The centre one I know is going to go right in the middle, but the other 2 I wanted to make sure were sort of evenly spaced. Okay, so I'm lining them up so the star at the top doesn't quite reach the very top of the card, but you can see there's a little bit of the tree hanging off the bottom of the card, and I'll be cutting that off. Now I decided I needed a little bit more detail on these trees, so what I did was I took out some Copic markers in colours that approximately matched the ink. So one that was slightly darker than Twisted Citron, one that was slightly darker than Peacock Feathers, one that was slightly darker than Mermaid Lagoon, and I just coloured in some of the leaves on the tree. And that's not all the colouring I'm going to be doing. I'll be adding a little bit more detail before I'm finished here. So I'm just cutting off the excess bits off the bottom of the trees here. And then I'm going to be adding on my sentiments. All right, so just making sure that's nice and flush with the edge. I did the same thing with the pink trees. At this stage, I'd forgotten to add in the little bit of extra colour on the pink one, but I did eventually go back and add that in. Don't worry. Okay, so I'm using some black foam dots behind my sentiment here so that the sentiment sits up a little bit on front of the card. And of course, that's the bit that takes the longest, is taking all those little backing pieces off the little foam adhesive, isn't it? All right, so for my final little touch, I wanted to add a bit of shine. So I pulled out my Hero Pearls. So this is in white, and I added the Hero Pearls to a whole lot of the little baubles, the little circles and the star at the top of the trees. And I just added a beautiful pearlescent shine to all of those. And I made sure that I popped these cards off to the side so that I didn't accidentally put my hand into them while that beautiful pearls were still wet. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very, very much to Kelly for being my guest today and providing such wonderful inspiration. I will put a link to Kelly's blog in the description below, and I hope to see you back again next time. Bye.